Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City, as I am, or Florence, Italy, as my guest is today, or North and South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, especially our loved ones in Ukraine, anywhere people are watching Fred Plotkin on Fridays in the world. Greetings. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And I have done this since April 24th of 2020, at the peak of the pandemic, when people were in their homes and in their lives and unable to be creative in ways that they wanted to be. So they had to find other ways of being creative, whether that was their work, like opera singers or writers, or whatever they did. We all had to improvise, we all had to invent, we all had to find new ways of doing and frankly surviving during that pandemic, which is still with us, that remained very unpredictable. And we had to learn new skills, we had to throw out old assumptions and so on. And I know that my life completely changed, and I know that just about every viewer and listener today underwent remarkable changes in their lives. So how does that bring me to my guest who today? I should say first that Myra Fiori is one of my dearest friends. So what you're going to witness today is not a conversation with someone whom I've known and admired slightly and seen them in their work and perhaps work with them professionally, although Myra and I have, but someone who's really one of my very deepest friends. And I wanted her to come and speak to us. I'm going to say this, Myra, that you were supposed to do it a while ago, but you were unable. So this is a rescheduling. And therefore, I knew what I wanted to talk to you about anyway. I always know what I want to talk to you about. Myra Fiori is the most creative person I know in the world. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I hope, is her vision of creativity, creativity for other people, how creativity enters in our lives. And when I thought, well, how do I list Myra in terms of her work, her career, which has been multifaceted and always original and groundbreaking. And I've decided, nope, I'm not going to give her a work or a job title. I'm just going to call her una creativa. And Myra is an American right now living in Italy. We find her today in Florence, but she travels. And so first off, Myra, welcome. Great to see you, even virtually.
Thank you, Fred. Nice to see you. It's been a while.
It has been quite a while. If I remember correctly, you and I met at the very end of the 20th century. We met in Portland, Oregon, and I was a finalist for a big writing award. I didn't win. There were 3 finalists. There were 432 candidates. We were down to 3. I didn't win, but the prize that I got was I was seated next to this person named Myra Fiori. And this is how we met. And while it would have been nice to have won that big award, I did better in the long run than the guy who won the award, because I got you as a good friend. And
Thank you.
Met.
That is incredible of you to say.
But it's true. It's true. It really is true. And we met over a shared interest, and we discovered that we had many shared interests. Coffee, which I always have with me. And one of the many things that you have done in your creative career is you have worked, you tell me the job title for Illy Cafe, Illy Coffee. What was your title?
In the end, my title was Vice President of Corporate Communications and Public Relations.
But what you really did, you were the creative vision for the company. And when we think of the design issues and elements of Illy Coffee, which begins, and I'm going to ask you to talk about Dr. Ernesto Illy, the man who basically created, his family created the brand, but he's the one who created the philosophy of Illy Coffee. We're not here to sell Illy Coffee, because on this program, I had Riccardo Illy a while ago. I also had Giuseppe Lavazza a while ago. And I love talking to people in the business world. I'm not in the business world, who do remarkably creative things. So, but we're not here selling any brand of coffee. But you happen to have worked for Illy Cafe. And start, if you would, talking about Dr. Illy as we knew him, and then what you learned from Dr. Illy, and then what you wanted to bring to this company that was an Italian company. You are an American, but you absorbed the culture of that company, if you please, Dr. Illy.
I met Dr. Illy when I first started at Illy in 1992, and it was love at first sight, as it is for most people who met him, who had the pleasure to meet him and know him. And I had some ideas for how I wanted to support the brand, and I was in charge of public relations, all the marketing, actually, all the marketing except for sales. I didn't oversee sales, which meant creating brochures. They didn't have any in English when I first started. This was before Illy was a global brand, and that was our charge. So Dr. Illy and I decided that we would do it through education. He loved America and Americans, and he wanted pre-Starbucks to have a coffee culture different from the filled bottomless cup. And it was
Myra,
quite an
because we have an
assignment.
international audience, please explain the concept of bottomless cup, which is a very American thing.
Yes, it is. It's you buy a cup of coffee for a very cheap price and free refills. You could just keep ordering more and more and more because it was cheap and commodity. So there weren't premium brands. And the assignment was positioning Illy as a premium brand at about twice the cost of other brands. And there was no real coffee culture in place at that time. So the assignment was huge, but Dr. Illy understood intuitively that I was creative, and he let me fly. In fact, all of them. I could not have done what I did had they not gone along with it. And as you can imagine, there were projects that I wanted to do that were so far out that it was hard for people to grasp the concept of it, much less give me the money to do it. And
But Dr.
Dr.
Illy
Illy was
was
my champion.
right, but Dr. Illy, who he died at 83, like 10 years ago, maybe?
No, 2008.
2008, okay. So he was of an earlier generation. His family founded the company, but he was an engineer.
A chemist.
A chemist, yes. And he understood all of that. He could tell you any chemical analysis of coffee, of everything about the process of growing, packaging, grinding, brewing, the whole thing. And where in this man who was the head of a small family business, an important one, but small, in northeastern Italy, in Trieste, which is a city that only became part of Italy in 1954. It had been under communist occupation. It suffered terribly in World War II. It suffered even worse in World War I. It had been under the Austro-Hungarian Empire from 1361 to 1918. It was the port of Vienna, in effect, and not necessarily an Italian city. So the DNA and the social and the cultural makeup of Trieste is very different from the rest of Italy. But where did he find it within himself and his courage, I would say, to bring in an American woman at that time who spoke with a beautiful Southern accent from South Carolina and had all of these qualities that I recognize? But where did this man from that background, intelligent though he certainly was, come to think, yes, let's not just sell coffee in Italy, but let's try to create something new that has an artistic edge, a creative edge, and a cultural edge. He was not edgy in my view. He was open,
Open, yes,
but not
very
edgy.
open. And I think he was very creative. As it turns out, as I did some reading for creativity, one of the primary things you must be to be creative is to be courageous, very courageous, to be brave, to be a risk taker. And obviously he was. So it was quite a risk to go into North America and try to create what has been created with a group of people outside of your culture, but he was courageous. And there was from his father already some values in place that he expounded on. Also, they love art and music as a family. The grandfather did, Dr. Ely did, and the children do as well. So I think he was creative and appreciated the arts. And so the company was already using art through one of the sons, Francesco, in his generation, and I worked with him. So they already were pointing towards art and creativity, and they all have creativity.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to them. And so it was fundamental in his nature to love beauty. He loved beauty, whether it was art or people. He was just an enthusiast for beauty. And he wanted to take that beauty to the world as well, not just coffee, but philosophy and everything that went with the culture, not just sell coffee. That's actually was never the big motivation, as it shouldn't be for any successful company. It's provide something to someone and then the money comes. So
I'm going to ask you a question that I've never asked you simply because I've never had to, because I understood your philosophy. But because people are listening to us, I don't want to state your philosophy. I want you to do it. I receive so many pitches and inquiries every day from all kinds of marketing and PR people. If it involves music, art, culture, I will look at all of them. I receive pitches for the most outlandish things that have nothing to do that anything I cover. I got one today for prams for baby carriages, and just not my work. And and this means that the people doing that kind of pitching and promotion are not paying attention. We had a dear friend, sadly gone, named Cara da Silva, who used to proofread the pitches she got. And if there was a grammatical or spelling error, she would automatically toss it out unless she felt sympathetic to the product, in which case she would call up the PR agency and help them rewrite their pitch to do it better. I have a big allergy to promotion and marketing and so on. And my philosophy in my life has been to pursue what I think is important and essential and beautiful and consequential and politically better for more people. And in my case, always, not only recently, about what we now call sustainability in the environment. I was that way as a little kid. And therefore, if I were to receive a pitch from a wine company, a coffee company, a chocolate company, which are things I'm interested in, I would look at it, but I would quickly find that I was in effect reading the same copy with just a different brand inserted or a different product. You and I, because we became friends and I already knew Illy Coffee, I didn't have to be persuaded of its quality. We've never had this discussion about marketing and about pitching, and where I would be in effect the person that you would want me to, write or speak favorably about something that you've represented. We've never gone there ever in our 25 plus years of friendship. And Is it just me, or do you approach everyone that way if you're trying to interest them in something that you are, for now, saying selling for other people? Because later we're going to get into the creative things that you do for yourself, which is a very different thing. But what's the difference between marketing and educating?
I think education is a way to market, and that's the route that Dr. Ely and I set up from the beginning. It was fundamental because there was no big coffee culture in the United States at the time. And so the first thing, it was just a given between the conversations that we had that we would approach it by educating people. And there's some other company in the US that advertises on television that their slogan is something like an educated consumer is the
Sims
right
Clothing,
answer.
an educated consumer is your best customer.
Right.
That was a
Right.
clothing store in New York
And
City.
it was, we came up with this before I heard that, but when I
Mhm.
heard it, I was like, he's on to it. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I also had taken my cue from the wine industry, Robert Mondavi, actually, who I admired as a person and had the pleasure to meet him and introduced him to Dr. Ely, and they became friends. But I used the wine model for educating. And then from educating, and we started with chefs because that was our market. And if we educated them and allowed them to experience it through a series of informing them of coffee, about coffee fundamentals, but also then doing a blind tasting with competitive market, whatever that market was, the two top coffees of that market. And we did blind tastings, and that was it, because the quality in that product was so far above. And Starbucks was emerging at the time, a few years into our journey. And we would select Starbucks because it was their marketing that was very loud, and they had shops, and we did not have coffee bars for consumers or anybody to experience the coffee. We were going through the trade. So it was an imperative, really, to educate first. And through that education, we grew the market and the trade. And then consumers tasted it at the table. And then Ely has the University of Coffee, which was a project Dr. Ely worked on.
Which I'm a graduate of.
University. Yeah. So all of that education led to a University of Coffee for trade and consumers.
Yep.
And so education was a big part of the project of building the brand globally.
But if a person is, as a student, open to education, often that involves inquiry and not just automatically accepting what you're told. And when we're talking here about questions of taste, in the literal sense of, olfactory, gustatory, taste buds, if my acidity in my mouth is different from the acidity in someone else's mouth, or if someone has a dry mouth, or someone has a cold and doesn't take in the fragrance of the coffee, it's subjective. And also, let's get deep into the process here, because coffee to me is a fascinating product, not only because I love the taste, but I compare it to wine in that a person who makes wine, she tends to grow her grapes right outside her home or very close by. She monitors her grapes. She will then make all the decisions in the cantina in the winery about temperatures, about how long to process, when to age, when to pick. All of those decisions happen within range of where the grapes are grown. Coffee, if you live in continental Europe and the United States, tends to come from places like Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, parts of Africa, especially Ethiopia, the equatorial band, more or less. And different coffees in different soils and different climates acquire different properties because of the climate, the soil, and so on. And there are two basic varieties of coffee, Robusta and Arabica, but the expression of those two varieties is very different from one place to the next. So the coffee company in Italy, let's say, or the United States, will develop relationships with growers and then import the beans. But if the beans are not properly picked thousands of miles, kilometers away, and then one bad bean gets in the burlap or canvas sack that's transported from Brazil to Genoa or from Colombia to Manhattan, the whole bag is ruined. And then how are these beans handled once they arrive in the city port? How are the beans roasted? All those decisions. To me, it's kind of like the miracle of the salmon that goes out to spawn and then comes back. It's, to me, a cup of coffee is a miracle. It's 50 beans that have to all be perfect. The machine has to be clean. The water has to be good. The person making the coffee has to know how to properly make it. I've had a lot of awful coffee in my life because the odds of getting a really good cup of coffee are slim.
Slim, yes, very
Slim.
slim.
And most people don't know good coffee. And this is, again, it's not about the brand. It's about the probability of everything going right from the moment the bean, the berry is born, wherever it's born, to the moment it winds up in your cup in Chicago or Berlin or Tokyo. And so to me, it's just an astonishing event when I have a good cup of coffee. And it's something deeply gratifying to me. And frankly, I think you know this, I created what I call Plotkin Blend, that is a combination of different coffees from around the world. That people love Plotkin Blend, and I will never reveal the secret of what's in it. It's part Illy, I will say that.
I was going to say, I do know, because once, maybe it was over a glass of wine.
Or 5. You got the secret out of me. I'm drinking some Plotkin Blend right now. But the point is, and it has to happen right every single time. And, I go to restaurants and I don't get the coffee. I'll rather just get it at home. I've converted Mormons who are not coffee drinkers to coffee drinking with Plotkin Blend. And I'm not joking. I'm really not joking about that. And with the explanation that God invented coffee, so it's okay. And but the point is, how can you market something or sell or educate about something that has so many variables and is so unpredictable? With wine, it's different from year to year. But when the wine is in the bottle, if it's properly stored and opened and so on and decanted, that's it. But with coffee, everything can go wrong. And so how do we educate on something that's so changeable?
Well, to go back to Dr. Ely, not only did he start the University of Coffee, and we used education to help build the brand. In the same year that I started, 2 other big happenings occurred. The arts program with the signed and numbered limited edition cups from Francesco Ely. But Dr. Ely also started an award in Brazil for the best coffee. He had heard about a similar program in another industry and decided it was a good program. It was the right thing to do, but it would ensure that they got the best quality. And they started with Brazil because they buy a lot of coffee there. So this award, they tasted all the coffees. Their scientists from Trieste went in and did the tastings, got the best of the lots, and they paid them not only top dollar for the crop, but also they got a monetary award that was very significant, especially then. And it's increased over the years. So he started the awards program, the Brazil Award, and it's been rolled out to other countries. So it promoted 2 things, farmers and giving them more money, but also sustainability, because then they could control and motivate the farmer to do a better job, and they could see they had visibility to the sustainability of it and encourage that. But in the same year, we launched a program in the US with what we called a pod. It was the perfect amount of espresso or coffee tamped for espresso extraction and put between two pieces of filter paper. And all the person had to do was to push a button, and it came out and eliminated all the variables that you just talked about. So they managed it to the factory, but the transformation, the variables in the transformation were mitigated by just this pod, and you put it in and push the button. And in fact, we started in the trade with those pods and a small machine instead of a big $10,000 machine. Even then, it was 10,000. So it was a very small machine, took up less counter space, and made a perfect one. Was it as perfect as what you could get in a coffee bar in Italy? Not exactly, but really, really close. So Ely had the patent on that system for 20 years, and they built it. So that was the answer that they came up with for the transformation, because it could not work in the hands of novices. And usually it was the busboy making the coffee in the restaurant. So to make it easy for the busboy, and we actually did an ad. It's like how to turn your busboy into a barista. So that's how we did it, was
But around
with
the
the
same time,
innovations from the company.
I remember also when you created this award for quality, that you, as the creative director, I'll call it, of Ely, engaged the, I don't know if he's Brazilian or Portuguese photographer, Sebastian Salgado.
He's Brazilian.
Brazilian, that's what I thought.
He's Brazilian, and he grew up on a coffee plantation.
Right. To do photography, but eventually not just about coffee, which would seem a natural outgrowth of what he experienced. But he, in effect, was, the Ely company was the Medici for Salgado's creativity, and unleashed him to do all kinds of creative projects. My question for you is, did you, Myra, have input with him about the subject matter, or did he come to you and propose things? And how did it work out with each commission?
For Salgado, it was a decision from the Ely family. And he had already done some projects that they admired. I think one on water. The project Genesis was born, and he was doing that. And then he came in to work in coffee and do the project for Ely. But I worked with him, and of course supported the project and used it in my work, but I was not the lead on that project.
Okay. But I remember that there were exhibitions here in New York of his work that were really wonderful and attracted a lot of attention. Another thing that you and the Ely family did that was new to me, although apparently it was not new, was the concept of a pop-up, which now we see pop-ups everywhere. Would you talk about what a pop-up is and how? I remember this pop-up was on 9th Avenue and about 12th Street or 13th Street.
West Broadway, yeah.
West Broadway, but there was I remember that one, but there was another one. It was an Ely pop-up, sort of where the Apple store and the meatpacking district is. Maybe that came later, but the first
that
one
came later.
Okay,
Yeah.
but
in
West Broadway.
2005, we launched a pop-up for 3 months in Soho, and that was my brainchild.
Yeah.
And it was because we did not have cafes for consumers to have the experience, the full experience. We relied on another party. So the idea was between Andrea and I, like, what can we do that they can have this experience short of opening a cafe? So it was before pop-ups were really big. I mean, they'd been done for sure, but it's like, why don't we do a pop-up and test the market and see what happens? And that's when I got to express a lot of my creativity and wild ideas. The first one being doing a 3-month pop-up in New York City with real estate prices and cost and
And explain
budget.
for people watching for whom English is not their first language, what is a pop-up?
A pop-up is a temporary brand experience. Usually, this can mean a lot of things, but in this case, a pop-up cafe is a short term. It pops up and it closes. It comes up and closes. That's pop-up. And so we did a 3-month, which is the pop-up part, but it usually a pop-up expresses the full range of what it is that the brand is trying to accomplish and express. And in this case, the pop-up was Galleria Ely, and it had all the elements of culture, which was what the brand stood for, was culture and coffee's place in culture. So instead of just a coffee shop or a coffee bar where people would come in and drink coffee and whatever, we made it an art gallery, hence Galleria Ely. So it was a full art gallery. We had several shows during the 3 months, Salgado being one of them, as well as Jim Rosenquist. So we had Marina Abramovic. It was a
Before she became
center.
Marina Abramovic,
Exactly.
is now a mega
Exactly.
brand and
Yeah.
cultural star of the world. But
Yes.
but that's part of what I know about you, Myra, that you're modest about. You spot these people before they become famous and you recognize their talents, and they move along in part their own talent, but in part because you know how to present them. And this is where you and I overlap somewhat, in that I have been in my opera world an impresario in certain cases, and a presenter and a teacher and someone trying to advance culture and ideas. And you've done that more in visual arts, but also in products, let's call it a product such as coffee. I've never really sold a product, but I've communicated art forms, especially performing art forms. And
You're selling. In that case, you're selling is just not the typical approach to selling. If
I'm
you're
educating.
educating and entertaining someone, you're selling them something.
Yeah. But not selling, making it available is really the way I see it.
I like that.
Because this program is in effect that I've done for 3 years by now, of, when the pandemic locked us all in, this was something I could do that gave me intellectual and creative outlet. I thought of you in 2020 and 2021 in New York. You were not here that much because many stores closed. Our theaters, our opera houses were closed, but there were musical pop-ups all over the city. There was a store on Broadway and about 62nd Street that just closed, and it left an empty glass window and a space. It was just an abandoned space. And musicians would go in there with masks on, string quartets, and perform. And we walking out in the street with our masks and bundled and gloves and binoculars and glasses that covered us, everything protecting us at that time, would stand there in the cold weather watching these musicians playing their string quartet with the sound piped out into the street. That was a pop-up of a different kind, responding to a different set of circumstances. And they too were being creative in their ways. They were expressing their creative need to perform. They were not making money at it, frankly, but they were doing it just because they had to do their art, whether they were paid for it or not. And that's impulse is very palpable. And go ahead. I see you want to say something.
I was just going to say that they are creative, and they tick all the boxes for what it means to be creative, which is an independence and a fierceness to make something, to do something. You're just driven to do something, to express yourself. And I wish we'd had that in Atlanta, which is where I was for most of the pandemic.
Yeah.
But I created my own art during that period. So.
Well, we're going to get to your own art, because that's a fascinating outgrowth that I watched virtually through screens, because I couldn't be present for most of it. But I want to get back a little bit to music. And actually, let's go back even further. One time you and I were on a very long drive from upstate New York back to New York City. And I had a particular CD of gospel music, which I adore. And you are from the South, and you grew up with a lot of Black people and their music and their culture, and love it as I do. But at a certain point, somewhere around Poughkeepsie, you said, well, that's enough of Shirley Caesar, who was the singer. Because, sometimes when people are together in circumstances where they don't talk about things, but they just do things, I think you realized at that moment that my love for gospel, in this case, Shirley Caesar, was genuine and very deep. And because that music, gospel, technically was born in Chicago, but its roots are in Mississippi and the American South. And this was more of a binding connection than coffee, than food, even than a lot of things. Was just that very long drive in that car on a weekend in the summer where there was a lot of traffic, and I could have played that music endlessly. How do you connect with people? I mean, Myra, how do you connect with the intangibles in people? Because what I recognized about you very quickly was your senses are at full blast all the time, and you perceive and you connect and you see things and you intuit things that frankly most people miss. And do you work at it? Is it a gift? Is it just the way you live your life? And is it exhausting to have your senses going all the time?
Yes. But as a creative, I was born with a tremendous amount of energy, which is another requirement. So for Shirley, and for the bigger question was, how do I do it? It's intuition. It's something I just have. And I follow it up by a tremendous amount of faith. And I learned about faith in my religious Southern upbringing. And that's what I share with Shirley. So Shirley's music has changed
And
my
she's
life.
from North Carolina, by the way. You're from South Carolina.
I could tell from her music, of course, that she's Southern.
Yeah.
But I connect to her spiritually. And I knew it from the first note, almost, just like, yes. But the reason I said that's enough is then she can sing and preach and sing and preach. And I think when I said that's enough, is she was only on preach. And so, and my window for preaching is about an hour.
Well, the thing about Shirley Caesar, I in January of 2023, I had the magnificent Twinkie Clark on this program.
I watched that.
Yeah, I mean, extraordinary. And that's she can preach too, but with her, it's all about the keyboard, the composition, the music, the spiritual connections that happen in her fingers on the organ, the Hammond organ. Shirley Caesar is more about histrionics, and I mean that in a good sense, the narrative of telling a story over 15 minutes. It's a parable about goodness and evil and temptation and all of that. I was not raised in a Christian Southern tradition at all. And I connect to this music because it's about human life. It's about things we all experience no matter what our upbringing. And I believe that we are all equal and we all have a commonality that maybe is expressed differently, but we are all fundamentally equal. And what Shirley Caesar in this particular case narrates is struggle and optimism and faith, as you describe it. I, if I were to use the word faith, for me, it's a very different kind of faith. I guess I come from a more scientific background and want to see evidence. I want the formulas to work. I want to understand things numerically. Maybe Dr. Illy was that way. But I'm not a scientist. I come from the arts, but nonetheless, I find that my underpinning is, I was writing to a friend the other day and he asked me about some of my heroes. And I said to him that my two heroes of the 19th century were Giuseppe Verdi and Charles Darwin. And they're very different kinds of people. And Darwin had a very religious wife, and even at home, he had to contend with her skepticism or her rock solid belief in something that he didn't embrace. Verdi questioned everything at a time when you don't question everything, and he expressed it in music about the human soul and our frailties. And I somehow connect to those things, but I also entirely connect sometimes to pure music, to the abstraction. And I have recognized that in you a lot. And Verdi has a line in one of his operas, ogni cor serba un mistero, every heart harbors a mystery. And where you might talk about faith, I would talk about mystery, which doesn't mean being secretive, but that we cannot understand even the people we love and know very well, and that we want to leave that space for that mystery that is the creative wellspring and the emotional wellspring that makes them, allows them to do what they do. And I see creativity in that it's kind of like with a truffle in the woods in Piemonte or Umbria, that the spores that create the truffle under the oak tree, you do not mess with the spores, you leave them and let the truffles come out, and then let the truffles be the sensorial experience. It's phenomenal. I just want to add one more thing about intuition. A friend of mine, Stephen Alexander Cole, an opera singer, many years ago said to me, Plotkin, you're a pleasure activist. And I thought he was kind of joking, but I seized on the term and I decided, what would that mean? And to me, it meant using the five senses to the absolute fullest all the time. And something that you and I have very much in common that I recognized in you immediately back in Oregon over the coffee was the degree to which you were perceiving with all your senses when most people around us were not. And I came to believe that if we activate our senses, we will have more pleasure, but also more understanding. And it leads to a sixth sense, which is intuition. That if we use our senses to educate ourselves and to be open to things that other people don't see, we acquire intuition and knowledge. Inadvertently, but beautifully, I think. Music does that for me. I don't analyze when I teach, as you know, when I teach music, I tell people don't analyze, don't compare it to something you've heard before. Just let it wash over you, go into you. And then if we talk about it, there are no right or wrong answers. And I find that people who embrace their senses and their creativity are happier often, despite the adversities that this world can present. And I'm not talking about high culture. I'm talking about walking in a field and smelling the dew and feeling the grass under your feet, or the wind on your face, or a particular sound that the breeze creates that other people don't hear, because it's about listening and not just hearing. It's about
paying
savoring.
attention.
It's about paying attention.
Being present.
Yep.
for the moment and sensing, letting it come to you, not going for it, but just letting it come to you. It's a very different pursuit. Just
And did you do that as a girl in Floyd
yes.
County, South Carolina?
Yes.
Yeah. So talk
I
about,
am today who I've always been.
yeah, but talk about discovering yourself in that context when maybe other people around you were not like that.
Well, I always felt different. And in the beginning, in that environment, I was shy, and but I had love. I was surrounded by love. So love floats a lot of stuff so I had love, but I did feel odd and out of place because I thought and created things in my mind that there were no examples for. And no one, when I tried to explain what I was thinking, could relate to it in any way.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided early on that I would put my head down, do what I had to do, and then pursue it outside of that environment as soon as I could. I would go out into the world and see what it was about. And in fact, that's when I made my connection to the world and was fully able to express myself. Not all at once, but discovering bits and pieces. I moved to New York from the South. The first stop was New York. And there I discovered jazz because I wasn't exposed to jazz as a child. I wasn't exposed to much classical music, some, very little.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a rural, very rural environment. And art, I was always interested in. And instead of pursuing boys or playing doll or whatever, I would go to the town library and look at art books. And so I was definitely a weird one in that environment. Like, what is she doing? Oh, she's at the library looking at art books.
Were you aware of nature? Because I've been to South Carolina, but not until relatively recently. I found it very beautiful, the parts that I went to. I've found the expression of nature. I was mostly surrounded by Black people, and their expression of nature was very attuned to the land and the soil. And one of them took me out into a field to gather field peas. And they taught me how to make pork chops in their style. And I remember asking, she said, "How many pork chops do you want?" I said, "Well, how big are they?" And she said, "It's the size of a raven's wing." Now, that to me was very beautiful, but I couldn't tell, as a New York boy, I couldn't tell you the size of a raven's wing.
That's so
And
Southern to describe something like
it was
that.
just gorgeous.
Yeah.
And when she said that to me, I practically burst into tears. She said, "Honey, why are you crying?" I said, "Well, I don't know the size of a raven's wing." So she said, "Here's the pork chop." This is the size of a raven's wing. But so kind, so generous, so sharing of what was theirs. And I was not there as a quote a food journalist or anything like that. I was just there on a brief vacation. And I went to South Carolina because I had to teach Porgy and Bess. And I decided that it was important to go to parts of South Carolina to expose myself to the terrain, the sounds, the flavors that may have in some way influenced George Gershwin and DuBose Hayward when they created Porgy and Bess in about 1932 or 33. But the beauty of that concept, that she would describe a pork chop related to the size of a bird, meant that they were tuned to nature in the most natural way. And they could talk about shrimp and, how the shrimp came in and how you handle it and how you open a crab to get the meat out properly. Everything was second nature. It was not, quote, foodie in any way. And I don't like to be foodie, but they were so sharing and caring of what they knew that they loved and were proud of, but also that I was genuinely interested in and not being a food tourist.
Growing up where I did was a blessing because I was connected to nature. I was born on a farm, and when I was born, my father was a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather was a farmer. So I was very much into nature and still am. And in fact, I have farmed from California to South Carolina to Maine in my adult life. So out of my age, maybe 30 years of that, I have at some point been doing a farming project.
Mm-hmm.
And so nature is very important to me, not only with the plants, but the animals as well. My grandmother taught me how to hunt the eggs, go out and get the eggs, how to feed the chickens, how to slaughter the chickens, how to dress the chicken. So everything from it's in the pen, here's how you catch it, here's what you do to make sure that it's done correctly to eat and respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
And then all the way to the table cooking it. So my grandmother taught me all of that. And I'm grateful for that. And still, I long for it, actually. I'm looking for a place in the countryside now because I can't live all the time in a city, although it's very important to me. The equally important is nature and the land.
Did you, specifically talk about something that you had sent up from the South? When Myra lived in New York, she had a larder, a sort of cabinet full of things that her family sent from the South, ingredients and cornmeal and grits. And one time you had a coconut cake arrive, and I love coconut. And this was simply the best coconut cake I had ever tasted. Were you aware of this coconut cake from back home, that it really was perhaps the best that could be had? Or did you have to taste other coconut cakes to understand that? Or maybe you don't think this was the best one, but I love coconut. So therefore, to taste something so glorious was thrilling.
Well, growing up in the South, I ate a lot of coconut cake.
Yeah.
From my aunts and relatives and cousins. And the cake you speak of is, in fact, one that was made by my cousin Brenda. And Brenda is just a simple Southern girl doing what they do. You marry, you have kids, and now she's older. She's a few years older than I am, so she's retired. But we're not talking about a baker or anything. She just makes cakes. And that cake ended up being written up in Vogue magazine, mentioned in Vogue magazine as the best coconut cake ever. So it's just, and I knew when I tasted it, yes, this is the best I've ever had. And then of course everybody would be like, but mine's better. Okay, I'll taste that one. But no, that is the best coconut cake that I've ever had. And I've eaten a lot.
But so again, we get to something that I care deeply about, and I know you do too: documentation and education. That when I was collecting field peas with that lovely woman in South Carolina, she didn't necessarily know that I was trying to learn this to pass it on. When I was a young man living in Italy, I used to chase old women because I wanted to learn from them what they did in their kitchens. I wrote a book about the food of Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, and I went up to the Carnic Alps and met 100-year-old women and learned the foods that they survived on in World War I and the food that they prepared that they brought to the front. This is not typical food writing. This is not something that appears in most magazines, but to me, it was about preserving a culture. And a lot of times people, maybe your cousin Brenda makes her coconut cake, but may not realize why it's special. And I always carefully try to toe the line between acknowledging the specialness of it for them, but not necessarily recommending commercialization, but also not stealing their light and their gifts, but documenting on their behalf something special in their lives that to them may be very normal. Italian women would always say, I would say, what you're doing, and niente, it's nothing. But I perhaps would recognize that what they were doing in the pan at their stove in their little kitchen was really something. I remember vividly, I was south of Rome, that I smelled garlic. It was just the best garlic smell I ever noticed. And I knocked on the woman's door and I asked her in Italian, I said, "Are you cooking with garlic? Is it a problem?" "No, no, no, but I want to know why it's so fragrant." She showed me how she sliced the garlic to get more flavor out of it. And that's now how I slice my garlic. But all of these things, it's a cultural patrimony, and it's the small things, but the essential things that if we let them be plowed under by globalization, by mass marketing, this culture will be lost. And it is culture every bit as much as Mozart and Philip Glass and anyone else that we consider culture. But it's a delicate line. You know, if you and I, and I'll say this as your friend, we have this gift for noticing what other people are doing that's meaningful, and we try in our different ways to preserve it and document it and share it. It's a challenge because frankly, not everybody in the world is receptive to the things that we recognize. Cutting garlic is not on the top of everyone's list of things they have to learn.
No, it mostly falls now to some TV chef or who often are not teaching cultural heritage. They're just making a television show.
Yep, I know. Entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a whole other, the diamond that is Myra with all of her facets. There's a whole other series of facets that you probably knew in yourself forever, but has been made visible more recently as a visual artist. Well, talk about your evolution into what you're currently doing, including, I see one of your works behind you, Dolly Parton.
Yes, Dolly's here with me.
Talk about.
After 25 years at Ely, I just one day decided that I wanted to do something else. I felt the company and I were both in a very good place, and that I had the energy to have another chapter, a really good chapter. So I retired, and without any idea of what I would do. And then I took a studio, an art studio in Atlanta, but I didn't know why. I got there, I moved from New York after 20 something years and said, okay, I'm going to Atlanta. It's got a good airport. I travel a lot, and it's a little less than New York. So one day I woke up after I got set up and said, well, what am I going to do now? What do I do? So I thought, I'll just make some art. I'll just start making something. And that night I went to bed after looking at this sculpture, which I think you've seen before. It's an antique sculpture. And over the years, I had decorated that sculpture for special occasions, Christmas or Easter bunny, or just for no reason, but I stuck jewelry on it all the time. I just would put jewelry on it. So I looked at that and went to sleep. The next morning I woke up, and the idea of having a decorated woman was fully formed in my mind, because I looked at these badges on the dress form and wondered, what would we be as women? What would we be given as awards? Because we're not, it's usually a military badge of some sort. So what kind of awards do women get? And I thought jewelry, and there was jewelry. And then I dreamed more or less. It was a combination of vision, dream, that it all came together to create a series of portraits and title it A Decorated Woman. And this series would be composed of my jewelry collection. So I woke up, I photographed my jewelry collection and assembled a library and started to make the pieces. And by a group of happenings that is so typical of my life, suddenly, before I finished the first piece, I was in a show in Palermo, Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who saw what I was doing, who just happened to stop by. And so before I finished my first piece, I had a show just on the concept. And I did a little research. No one that I found online had ever used jewelry as a medium for composing art, or, I mean, jewelry brands put it in their ads or in their work, but not using it as a medium to build portraits or to make things. So that was just a dream. It just came to me. It's like, there it is in front of you. Put the dots together, which is another identity of creative people, is that they can connect dots in a different way. It's this dot and that dot in different fields that don't seem to have a common thread, but they can see the connections between those dots.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens to me quite often. A lot.
And who are some of the women you've portrayed in your series of decorated women?
Well, part of this project is also to educate, but that came after the ideas. Like, what do I want to do? I want to inspire and empower women, especially young women, to know that there are women before them whose shoulders they stand on, but they probably haven't heard of them because history doesn't include us often.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to tell stories through these pieces and educate, back to educating. So I selected women who had done things. They were the first to do something or accomplish something, or some of them are known, some of them are unknown. For instance, the woman who invented Wi-Fi, Hedy Lamarr.
Yeah.
The woman who invented computing, programming specifically, computing, and predicted that we would be where we are today and where we're going with artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
She predicted that this machine that she didn't invent, she just programmed it and understood it more than anybody else, its potential. So she's in my series, Ada Lovelace is her name. And a woman invented GPS, the only ruler of China that oversaw the age of peace and the Silk Road, and introduced Buddhism and a lot of reform that were for elderly and women, giving them rights. Mm-hmm. So it's about human rights and contributions to culture and society overall. And among them is Dolly. Of course, we all know what Dolly's doing. And
well, we don't all know what Dolly's doing. We know, of course, she's a great singer and composer, but Dolly had a very important role in funding the research for the mRNA, I think it's called, vaccine that addresses COVID.
Correct.
She gave
But before that,
yeah,
she started when she first started to make money, she started a reading program for the part of her up in the Appalachia where she's
East
from.
Tennessee, yeah.
And then it spread around, but so she's very much for literacy and reading, and put her money there before the vaccine. But she's always done very charitable things to give back to educate and support people who need it, who aren't exposed to it regularly. So she has my heart, and she's just an all-around great person. In the piece that I did, She holds in her hands a book, which is actually a little piece of jewelry that was a book. And it has a girl running on the front of it, which I like very much. So everything's composed of jewelry. She has guitars, musical notes that also came from pieces of jewelry that I had. But more importantly, the message is the book and reading and educating.
Do I remember Elizabeth Taylor as one, or?
Yes,
Yeah.
Elizabeth Taylor is one because she suffered a lot.
Yeah.
And with drug addiction, with food addiction, alcoholism. And when she went to Betty Ford, instead of hiding the fact
Betty Ford Clinic being the place where people with addictions have gone.
Rehab, yes. So she went there, and rather than playing the diva, she did what they told her to do and made her own bed, cleaned her own toilet, and then she got her life on track and did the amazing work that no one else could have done, maybe, which was to convince Ronald Reagan to change the attitudes towards HIV. And she started AMFAR with a group of scientists and doctors.
American Foundations for AIDS Research. She was a good friend of Rock Hudson, Hollywood actor who died of AIDS, one of the first famous figures to do that, about 1985, I think. And Reagan and Nancy Reagan were in the White House and could barely utter the word. And Nancy Reagan, Rock Hudson was in the American hospital in Paris. And long story short, they didn't really help him because they didn't want to be seen to be favoring a Hollywood friend. And Elizabeth Taylor sold off a lot of her diamonds, of which she had many, and raised all this money and spoke very passionately all around the world to raise money for support of persons with AIDS, but also research about how to fight the disease. And she was fundamental. She also liked to get married. She was married 8 times. And the comedian Joan Rivers said that when Elizabeth Taylor got married, they threw minute rice instead of regular rice. For people who don't know, minute rice is instant rice, because why waste the good rice when Elizabeth Taylor will get divorced again? But she was a magnificent figure. I mean, she was a beautiful woman, but so much more than that.
So did you know that the title of my piece that I did of hers is titled, "Where is My Husband?"
No.
And I looked at over 2,000 images of her before I found the one that I wanted to use, the face that I wanted to use of her. And of the 2,000 or so that I looked at, all of them were her as the most beautiful woman in the world, which she was named at the time. And I didn't want to portray her as the beautiful woman. We've seen that. I wanted to portray her, her suffering and what she had gone through in order to emerge one of the biggest humanitarians on the planet.
Yep.
And what her legacy is, the work that she's done, and not her beauty. Because many of my women, Hedy Lamarr being one of them,
Gorgeous.
are not known for their inventions or their humanitarianism. They're known for their beauty, which often was a bad thing to have. I mean, it would get you somewhere, but it also stopped you from being able to fully express yourself and everything that was in you. Hedy was, at the time, she came up with the formula for, it's like train spotting, but frequency hopping.
Right.
Which is Wi-Fi. She was the most beautiful woman in the world and going through a lot of problems in Hollywood with what they wanted her to do and be, and what she wanted to do and be. And in between a film, she created Wi-Fi in her trailer.
Yep. I met Elizabeth Taylor once. It would be sort of late March, early April of 1987. And I was performance manager of the Met, and we had just done our new spectacular production of Puccini's Turandot, which is a production that's still there. And it was the hottest ticket in New York City, much more than a chorus line. I only remember what musicals were on then, but whatever the musical was, didn't hold a candle to trying to get into Turandot. And the last performance, the whole world tried to get in. And Elizabeth Taylor didn't even have such a great seat. I remember her seat. It was row O in the middle of the section, not an aisle seat. So she'd have to climb over people to get out. And her date was Halston, the fashion designer who later died of AIDS. And as the manager on nights like that, I kind of got the pick of who I would maybe want to escort or entertain. And we had we had everybody there that night. We had Elizabeth Taylor and we had Birgit Nilsson, the great opera star, the Turandot of the past, coming to hear Eva Martone, the Turandot of the moment. And I remember thinking, do I want Elizabeth Taylor or do I want Birgit Nilsson? And I ultimately decided that I would escort Birgit Nilsson and Halston would escort Elizabeth Taylor. But I met her. The eyes were violet. She was very short. She was extremely beautiful. She was very lovely. I explained to her that anything she needed that night, I was available to help. And she said, you know, can I escort Birgit Nilsson and you can have Halston?
Didn't go for that deal, did you?
Because she understood Birgit. She understood that what Elizabeth Taylor was in the movie world, Birgit Nilsson was in the opera world, the ultimate. Mm-hmm. And Nilsson arrived from Sweden for this magnificent performance. And Zeffirelli was there, and James Levine conducted, and Placido Domingo, and the whole world. And it was just one of the great nights in the history of the Metropolitan Opera. And I was escorting Nilsson, and the crowds parted like something out of the Bible as we walked down the aisle. And Nilsson had a great seat. She had something like row E on the aisle. And the entire theater rose in this enormous roar for Birgit Nilsson coming back. And someone pointed at her and said, "Look, it's Joan Sutherland." And Nilsson said, there, I love Joan Sutherland. And the audience cheered. But what struck me that night, Elizabeth Taylor understood that she was not the center of attention and allowed other people to have the spotlight. And she sat in the middle, a good seat, but not a great seat, in the middle of a section, beautifully dressed, and people let her be, because on that night, it was not about the movies, it was about opera. And a momentous night in opera history. And that spoke so much to me about her, that her understanding that she did not have to be the center of attention all the time. Even beautiful and glorious as she was, and all the, because that was exactly the period when she was beginning to stand up against Reagan and against anyone who tried to abuse people who were suffering with HIV. Do you have women in your mind who might be a future person in your series?
Yes, there's a list, a long list, because as it turns out, women have done a lot of great things in the world. So the list is endless, really, but I have my active list. And recently, I discovered someone I want to do a portrait of. That's on the list of the music that I gave to you that I wanted to hear.
So Florence Price.
Florence Price.
Yep.
Because I knew the music and I liked the music, but when I was listening to it and then reading, I would sit around and listen and read about her. I discovered that she was the first woman whose work had been played by a major symphony.
In the United
So
States.
in the United States,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes.
And she
So
was African American,
and she's
way ahead of
African.
her time.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
her work now, thankfully, is finally being discovered enough. And the Chicago Symphony did it a while ago. And I believe the LA Philharmonic and the New York Philharmonic and Philadelphia Orchestra has done a lot of Florence Price. And it's about time. But what I think is very, very important, it's terrific that Black artists are doing her work. I don't only want Black artists to do her work. I was very glad when Riccardo Muti, the Italian conductor, undertook to play Florence Price on a program that may have included Berlioz or Schumann or whoever, so that we come to understand that Florence Price, the composer, belongs there, that it's not sort of a novelty item or tokenism that we occasionally will bring in one of these lesser known composers, but she really belongs there. And just because we're late in discovering her work, because she faced racism and sexism back in the 1920s, I believe, and 30s, as a woman trying to compose. I mean, there was Dame Ethel Smythe, who was a British composer, barely got her works produced, and she was from about 1903. And it's unfortunate that when we talk about women in classical music, Clara Schumann, Nannerl Mozart, the sister of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, another person, by the way, that you have. Myra has provided a list of music that I recommend. It includes Florence Price, Mozart, Ludovico Einaudi, and Philip Glass, which is a very lovely cross section. But we think of Clara Schumann and Mozart's sister as appendages to the man, rather than protagonists on their own.
It's the same as for a lot of women artists who are finally getting shows and being recognized. They were wives of famous artists. And so, but there's so many who didn't have that connection, who were working in the shadows. And I really love discovering them, as well as touting some of the women whose names you do know. For instance, Martha Stewart is in my series.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, she was in the series I thought of her because she was the first self-made billionaire, female billionaire in the United States. So that's why she made a cut. But then as I started to think about the piece, it's like, that's not why she's here at all. It's that she has, like Elizabeth and like these other women, suffered for her art and suffered. So she suffered because she played the game with the boys and they turned her in and she had to do some time.
Yeah, let's
Not every
explain that to
day.
people outside the US. And Martha Stewart, I forget the financial issues, but there was some case where she did not fully pay whatever she was supposed to pay. I don't know. But I remember that she was sent to prison and famously had to clean the toilet with a toothbrush, that kind of thing. And for people who don't know her, she famously is perfectionistic and exacting, and is considered not easy to work with by certain people. And therefore, it was seen by some people as a comeuppance, as getting what she deserved, that she wound up in jail. But her sentence for the quote crime was rather large compared to people who committed similarly not paying a certain tax or fee, who got a slap on the wrist. And I think Martha Stewart was held up as an example of this is what we do to women who get too high on the hog, to use a
Right, too
Southern
big for their
expression.
britches, kind of thing. The
To use a
Southern
Northern
term.
expression. uh, but yeah, I mean, this program is seen all around the world, and I really want people elsewhere to be aware of what you're doing, because I am. And the point that you are subtly, or maybe not so subtly, making is women who have made great contributions are not necessarily recognized and acknowledged. And if they are, it's for their personality or their beauty, so that a Katharine Hepburn or a Betty Davis would be known, yes, as a great actress, but also for the forcefulness with which they had to push themselves to get the kind of career that they had. Are you familiar with a woman, she died a few years ago, named Dr. Matilda Krim, Krim?
No?
I commend her to you.
Okay.
Matilda Krim was Swiss. She was, in effect, the silent partner of Elizabeth Taylor in the AIDS battle, and was the person who, she was a physician. Her husband, I forget exactly what he did, whether he was a film producer and publishing, but they had a great deal of money, and Arthur Krim, so that she, Matilda Krim, could use her money and her position to not have to worry about earning a living, but to fight the battle about AIDS and prejudice and communication, when she seemed like, she looked like Simone Signoret, which to me is terrific. She had a slight European accent, but she was so powerfully persuasive. And when you put together the glamour and beauty of Elizabeth Taylor, I thought Matilda Krim was beautiful too, but was rock solid in the science. And to me, one of the most compelling speakers that I've ever come across. And English was not her first language, but she somehow captured the essence of ideas beautifully and was sexy in her brilliance to me. That,
Right, a dynamic duo, the two of them.
yeah, because, yeah, Elizabeth Taylor, absolutely. But Matilda Krim was just, I mean, not in terms, look, she was a very attractive woman, but you didn't look at Matilda Krim and you looked at her brain, you looked at her soul, and you were able to get past the nice appearance to this very deep person who, when she started communicating, was so persuasive, not in a bullying way, but just because she knew all the facts. And she was able to separate prejudice and discrimination from science and make the case. And I think of her as among the great scientists. We think of Marie Curie and Rosalind Franklin was her name, and other people like that. But Matilda Krim.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing
Fascinating figure. Fascinating figure, because behind every great woman is maybe another great woman.
It's just not in the history books, right?
That's
Like
not
that.
this good.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, so how do we repair that?
I don't know. I look at my work as just a seed, and I know that there are so many others doing wonderful things, just planting seeds that will one day grow. But it goes back to where we started with
Farming
education,
and
education
farming.
and exactly farming. Yeah. So education is key, and I am not a person to go out and teach or do a road show. And I wanted to make art. It was a dream, and I had the opportunity to do it. So it all came together in that way, was if you create something, a story visually, and you can capture the attention of people visually, then that gives you the opportunity to tell the story in a different way, and also in a literal way behind it, through the title, through the synopsis that in the shows. And a lot of the women, since this is usually about music, there's another one in my series, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who I know you
Oh my
love
goodness.
as well.
Who could
Another first,
sing and play the guitar. Her singing and guitar playing influenced Elvis Presley.
she's known as and is the mother of rock and roll. And
Yeah.
there are several projects in development right now. A play opens in DC sometime in the future, in this year, I think, about her. And also there are a documentary, and now I know some people who are putting together a feature film on her.
Mhm.
So the story is about to be told to sort of correct the series of events and how rock and roll came about, to give her the credit she deserves for that, because she was the mother.
There is a YouTube video that I know I've sent you that I want people to watch. It's Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Tharpe, walking into a railway station with her guitar and then setting up and just singing. And the way she walks, her walk says it all, because she's walking in the rhythm of the music that she's about to sing, but non-musical people wouldn't recognize that. But I see that as already in her head, the music is playing. So at the moment when she stops on the railway station track, which is very impressive anyway, and turns and faces people and picks up her guitar, she had been singing in her head for 5 minutes, because she walked all the way into town, building this musical energy in her head before she finally performed. I hope that whatever film they do of her somehow tries to recreate that, and whoever the actress is playing her understands that, the way you, Myra, have the art in your head before you put it out in visual form. A musician has music in her head well before she turns and performs it. And I don't know if the writer has it in his head. Writing is different. Writing, you have to just, as Hemingway, I think, said, you have to just sort of put the paper in the typewriter back then and bleed and just sit there and bleed and correct and change and change and change and edit and reduce. And you're lucky to get a paragraph a day, but you have to do it every day. You have to, no matter what, get up and do it, even if you don't have it. Whereas a musician, I think James Levine, the conductor, always said to me that he always had music in his head. And it may not have been the music that he was about to perform, but something was happening in his head that, as you were saying before, these unseen connections. I once pointed out to him that I heard a chord progression in a Schubert song that reminded me of something from a Mozart concerto. The great James Levine had never thought of that one. And he thanked me for awakening him to the fact that these things connect, and whether Schubert imitated Mozart or whether it just happened that these two brilliant composers found the same chord progression. That's what we live for as people who love creativity. I am astonished when I see other people making things. I'm not jealous. I'm grateful when I see that, because it's the most human expression. You said love was very important when you were a girl. Yeah, but I think that ultimately we're on our own, like it or not. We're born alone and we die alone, and we got to create something and make something of beauty, value, insight, improvement for others, in addition to self-expression.
Inspiration is good, though. Artists inspire people, creative people inspire other people.
Yep.
Writers inspire their words. So giving inspiration to the world is something creatives do naturally. And
by the way, inspiration, the source of the word, it comes from breathing. And because we breathe it in and perhaps we exhale it as well. But I always remember that inspire, breathing it in, taking it in, but then within our person, we do something with it to bring it out in perhaps a different form that had not been seen before. You mentioned in passing about film, Myra. I know also you have been involved with film.
Yeah.
Go there, talk about your film work.
I've made 2 short documentaries over my career, and I have another film. I've written the script for it, and so it's in development, about Artemisia Gentileschi, also one of my subjects.
Who was she? I know who she was, but who was she?
17th century artist, whose father was very famous, Orazio Gentileschi, but she also painted and is not known as he is, but recently, I would say in the last 10 years, becoming more known. So I've made these films, but one was about an art project that I did with an artist and architect, and the other one was titled Inspiring Creativity. And
And
it
where
was
can people see it?
on YouTube.
Okay.
On YouTube, Inspiring You Creativity is one, and the other is Push Button House, which was a project I did with an artist architect, which was to take a shipping container and push a button on a computer, and the house opened up into a fully functioning house. So it went from shipping container to house in like 90 seconds.
And where was that?
It debuted at the Venice Biennale.
I don't mean the film. Where was the house?
The house debuted at the
Oh,
Venice
so
Biennale.
you've been exhibited at the Venice Biennale,
Well, the project has.
the project in which you were
The project
involved.
has. I was more an executive producer, if you will.
Mhm.
I
Okay.
heard about the concept and understood. When I heard it, it was very interesting to me because connecting those dots, coffee, I was working at Ely, so coffee goes around the world in shipping containers. And I had heard about this artist who was making them into houses literally, but
Mhm.
had created this art project. So I contacted him and said, you know, I have this idea. Would you work with me? And we worked together and created this push button house that debuted at the Venice Biennale. And then since went on a trip around the world. It was also shown in Beijing, San Francisco, Miami, New York,
And that's what I was asking. Where was it shown in New York?
at Time Warner.
That's right.
At Time Warner.
On 59th Street, right?
Yes.
Columbus Circle, yeah.
Columbus
Right.
Circle. Yeah. And the film is about the making and setting up of the push button house, how it's made, how it functions, the process. So it documents the process of the project.
So you know that I think, and I know I'm right, that opera is the greatest art form of them all. For the simple reason that it combines all the other classic art forms of the past. It combines literature, music, dance, visual arts, poetry, acting, theater, lighting, all of that into a synthesis of something that is greater than any of the individual art forms. I also believe that opera is the mother of cinema, or the father of cinema, the parent of cinema. Opera fostered technology, whether it's recording, radio, the use of electric lighting first happened in opera houses. Opera has always been a leader in terms of technology. Opera streaming on our devices that you and I are talking to each other on now. What I want to ask you is not your favorite opera or anything like that, but this is not self-serving, but I have a reason I'm asking. What's it like to go to the opera with me?
One of the best experiences of my life, and here's why. Beforehand, you love to educate. It's just natural to you. So I've told you this before, I don't do a lot of reading beforehand if I don't know the opera, because I know that I'm going to get what I need and much better than what I could read and consume. It comes so sweetly from you and so naturally from you, and I just take it in. Whereas reading about it is a little more cumbersome for me. So the education, the experience, and I have to say sometimes because you're a bit of a celebrity in the opera world,
Please,
that,
no.
you know, it's like going with someone famous to the opera.
No, I'm not
So
Elizabeth Taylor or Birgit Nilsson. But no, the reason I ask, I really was not self-serving. It's because when I've gone to opera with you, I learn more than when I go to opera with a lot of other people. And even operas I know backwards and forwards, because you see and hear different things than what most other people I take. the famous line in the movie Moonstruck, for which I was a consultant, where Cher watches Mimi die in La Boheme, and she says, I knew she was sick, but I didn't know she was going to die. Is a wonderful response. But I've heard that kind of response from other people. Whereas Myra would go to La Boheme with me and observe things like the way the philosopher decides to sell his coat to get medicine for the dying Mimi, and what it means philosophically to sell your coat, and the meaning of a coat, and the meaning of cover, and how that detail, which is 2.5 minutes in the opera, spoke to you so profoundly that that brought out all kinds of things that I never really thought about in the character Colleen. I had in the general way, and when I've directed it that way, but you telescoped into that. Obviously, La Boheme being an opera about creative people who struggle. Rodolfo and Marcello the painter, Rodolfo the writer, how they have writer's block, how they're not selling their work, how their desire to create combines with their desire to be loved and to love others. It's an opera that, and we've seen a lot of operas, but I just sort of picked Bohème because it's about young creative people. And the other day, it was Salman Rushdie, I heard say the other day that the young creative person has to show, he said he has to show that he is credible and believable. The older creative person has to show that he has energy and can still do it. And, we think about the arc of the artistic life, and it troubles me that, many young people are the thing of the moment, but then they're kind of discarded when the next thing of the moment comes. And many older creative artists are either looked at as, wise sages or completely irrelevant. And it brings up the question of criticism, because when I go to opera with you or with anyone, I don't want to put on my critical hat. I want to put on my sensory hat and skin. And do you read critics? Do you read analyses of art and culture, or do you skip that?
I skip it. I skip a lot of it. After the fact, I will read a few lines to get a feel for what the critics are saying, what the public is saying about something, but I just don't want to be influenced. I want to see something, make my own evaluation of it, and then whatever it is that I determine for me, I listen. I'm willing to change my mind or to learn something that I may not have picked up from a piece, but no, I don't like that. I don't like that, because I think a lot of times critics are biased, not so much for the structure of something and the way it should fit, and they have biases for, I don't know, pick a category, any category, but that they have biases. It's human to be. And
Or
also,
preferences rather than biases. I mean, I can think of a very famous critic who loves the piano, and there are 2 or 3 great pianists, and I agree with him, these are great pianists, for whom they are the current standards, and like it or not, he tends to compare other pianists to those 2 or 3 pianists. And so I wouldn't call it a bias as much as just a preference, or what strikes chords and what strikes emotion in this critic when he hears it. The problem is, how do we convey that? Again, we get back to this thing of education, that the critic can be an educator. The critic can be a scholar. Not too long ago, I had the critic on the show, Tim Page, who I think carefully threaded the needle in his career between passing judgment, but also extending knowledge and creating enthusiasm. And, it's hard to create. but we have to do it.
Preparing to give you the music that I preferred, I read a lot of negative from about Philip Glass.
Yep.
And I didn't agree with any of it, but I could see that the critic had a certain set of parameters and information that he used to judge the piece. And Glass's work didn't fit into it, but it's what I gave you as my favorite.
Right.
So,
well, I know you've met Philip Glass. How does meeting a creative artist positively or negatively affect your view of his or her art? I've met great actors, for example, whose work I love, but they were just horrible people.
well, I was going to say it goes two ways. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. With Glass, it was, I expected him to be from his music, actually. I expected him to be more stern and not as friendly. And certainly because of his reputation, like, who are you? Move on. But it wasn't that way at all. He's very warm and generous and kind and friendly. But, most creatives rather, are edgy, so they can show up, they see the world in a different way, and what's important to you is not necessarily important to them. So my experience with him, though, only made me love his work more, to know that the human who made that work also was a really good human.
Final question, although I know we could continue for hours. And I just want to mention to people, Myra Fiori is not in Florence, South Carolina at the moment. She's in Florence, Italy. So I'll ask you two questions. What are you doing in Florence, Italy?
I am awaiting my permesso di soggiorno. And while I wait, I was able to get a show in Venice, my first solo show.
Right.
And so I had a run of 3 months in Venice. And I am also creating work. I work every day on my art. It's something I can do with computers, so I'm free to be wherever I want to be, meeting wonderful new people, going to shows and an opera, La Traviata. And Domingo was supposed to be in the performance like last night, but was
as the father, as your mon père.
Yeah.
So here's my final question. Can and should a creative person, whatever he or she does, be cognizant of the market, be cognizant of the public, or create just purely for the act of creativity?
Just create. I had to consider that in my corporate life, but it's not something when you're just creating art. Creativity, yes, sometimes, but art, no, not at all. You don't make it for a market. You make it and then figure out where it belongs and where it goes.
And often these great works, not yours, but other people's great works, don't get discovered. I mean, Vincent van Gogh sold one painting in his lifetime and just was not appreciated or understood. There are many great artists. For every Michelangelo who was a big hit in his lifetime, or Verdi, there are many who go completely ignored and, are only appreciated much after the fact. Florence Price being another. Exactly. And so, we got to eat, but we also, if we are driven by creative impulses, that's what we have to do. Air, shelter, water, clean, safety for everyone, but then creating, if you feel so driven. There are people who don't, and that's fine. But if you were born with that creative gene, you have to do it. You feel unhealthy, in my view, you feel unhealthy until you've said about creating every day.
I agree. I have to do it. I
Yeah.
have to be creating something. I have to be building or making something. It doesn't have to be art, but I have to be making something.
I'm going to go make a cup of coffee.
And I'm going to make dinner.
Myra, my dear, thank you so much
Thank
for
you, Fred. It
sharing
was a
your
pleasure.
ideas and
Thank you
your
so
work.
much. It was
And I
really
do
fun.
hope to see you on one or the other side of the Atlantic for coffee and coconut cake and shrimp and grits and who knows what else.
I'll bring them to you.
You do that, I'll eat them.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.